I'm sure we're all well acquainted with the horrors of the National Socialist regime in the Second World War. The Third Reich has left an immutable impact on the psyche of the world itself, from the deadly effectiveness of early modern blitzkrieg to the atrocities of the concentration and death camp systems which perpetrated the mass murder of millions of Jews, Poles, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, anti-Nazi Christians, political opponents, and Soviet prisoners of war, and the detention and torture of millions more. These crimes and the advent of camera, video, telegraph, and radio technology, which were able to document them in a vividness unlike anything the world was faced with before, cemented Chancellor Adolf Hitler's legacy as one of history's most evil men. However, despite the brutal imagery and ingrained emotional response which Hitler's very name evokes, not many of us are familiar with the story of the dictator's life before he rose to power in Germany. In the aftermath of the German Empire's defeat in World War I, Adolf Hitler was a wounded, aimless, and desperate veteran, like many others in his situation. Before the war, as many of us know, he was a failed painter, having faced rejection from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in Austria. After his rejection, Hitler became homeless for a time, peddling his art in the form of postcards, before joining the military, a career which gave him a newfound purpose and duty, and a sense of responsibility which he seemingly lacked before. But of course, with the defeat of Germany and Austria-Hungary in the war, and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to almost entirely demilitarize, and this meant large layoffs in the army on top of the typical reduction that would follow a transition from war to peacetime. After Hitler's recovery from injuries sustained during a British gas attack, he made his way to the city of Munich in 1919, deciding that he needed to remain in the military at all costs, as he deeply feared returning to a life of poverty and homelessness. Munich, at the time, was in a state of upheaval, as a wider revolutionary fervor was gripping the region of Bavaria due to the economic and political conditions which followed the Versailles Treaty. The People's State of Bavaria was declared, as southern German politics had become extremely polarized between the left and right. The Weimar government in Berlin sent in troops to remove the declared communist government in Munich, which they successfully did by the 6th of May 1919. The German military took the hint, and began prioritizing the monitoring and suppressing of potential unrest and extremism. To this end, Captain Karl Mayer, the head of the Education and Propaganda Department of the Bavarian Reichswehr, recruited former Lance Corporal Hitler as an undercover operative. Initially tasked with attending anti-Bolshevik training sessions at the Volksverlager Lechfeld, Hitler began developing a talent that would define his future: oratory. His speaking abilities caught Mayer's attention, even in spite of his often anti-Semitic speeches, earning him a position as one of 26 instructors in an anti-communist propaganda initiative. By mid-1919, Hitler was appointed as an intelligence agent within a reconnaissance commando. He began his duties under the Weimar intelligentsia by surveying the extremist left and right-wing organizations in Bavaria. It was in this capacity that Hitler encountered the German Workers' Party, or DAP, a minor right-wing group founded earlier that year. The party, under Anton Drexler, espoused nationalist, anti-Semitic, and anti-communist ideals that actually happened to resonate with Hitler. While observing a meeting on September 12, 1919, Hitler's fiery rebuttal to a guest speaker's criticism impressed Anton Drexler, who invited him to join the party. Hitler asked his commander if he should accept the offer, and on Mayer's affirmative instruction, assuming that this would be a great opportunity to gain more information about the DAP, Hitler officially became a member, marking the beginning of his political ascent. Though still technically an intelligence agent, Hitler's ambitions quickly outgrew his assignment. As the party's propaganda chief, he transformed its public profile through electrifying speeches that drew increasingly large crowds. By February of 1920, Hitler had rechristened the organization as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, which we all know the name of in the West. His meteoric rise rendered his military pay irrelevant. He left the Reichswehr in 1921 to dedicate himself entirely to his burgeoning political movement. The irony of Hitler's role as an army spy lies in its unintended consequences. Captain Mayer, who had described Hitler as a stray dog looking for a master, inadvertently unleashed a force that reshaped German politics and ultimately the world. By assigning Hitler to the DAP, Mayer provided the platform for a man who would dismantle the very military institutions he sought to preserve. The rest is history. Germany under Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, annexed the Sudetenland, declared war on Poland, and caused the Second World War, which forever changed the political and social norms of the European continent, and of course, the world. But what if all that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Lance Corporal Adolf Hitler, instead of abandoning the Reichswehr, fulfilled his duties unquestioningly and dismantled the German Workers' Party from the inside out? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or joining our Discord server linked below. Thanks, and enjoy the video. At the outset, Hitler wasn't necessarily an ideologue, at least outspokenly, though his writings and speeches to fellow members of the army indicated the early anti-Semitic and nationalistic undertones, which would later be amplified by his presence on Germany's political stage. When the Reichswehr assigned him to monitor the German Workers' Party, it was a small, obscure group with little influence, but a dangerous potential for radicalization. Agent Hitler's orders were thus clear: infiltrate, assess, and neutralize. So what if he simply followed orders and set the ideological undercurrents of his mind, however powerful they may have been at the time, aside, and did his duty for his country and commanding officer? If we assume that the DAP is simply taken out early, crippled by Agent Hitler's efforts, the Weimar-Overton window is left primarily to the, at the time, more centrist Social Democrats and their coalition, and the far leftist factions. By this point, the Abwehr, the intelligence and espionage arm of the Weimar military, which was technically illegal under the Treaty of Versailles, would have been founded. And thus Hitler would soon be tasked, along with other members of the army intelligentsia, to join the Abwehr and continue to crack down on politically extreme groups in Germany, including the leftists, some of whom were even being propped up by the Soviet Union. So this really begs the question: could the communists and the leftists have been a genuine threat to the dominance of the Social Democratic Party in Weimar politics? During the NSDAP's rise, there was another party that was rising in popularity, and that was the Communist Party of Germany, or the KPD, by the early 1930s, aided by Soviet backing. The KPD did certainly present a looming danger to the SPD, but the KPD historically failed to build coalitions, never capturing more than 17% of the vote, and the widespread fear of communism among the German populace outside of leftist intellectual circles would probably have alienated the KPD, something that didn't really happen to the National Socialists during their sharp rise. But even though they wouldn't be under threat from communist political takeover, the SPD would certainly have to deal with a bunch of other issues during their time in power. Economically, the Weimar Republic would be facing Herculean challenges. The reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles and the global shock of the Great Depression had already pushed Germany to the brink in our own timeline. But with no extremist parties destabilizing politics, the moderate coalitions in the Weimar government would perhaps implement more Keynesian reforms, perhaps modeling some of their economic policy off of that of the Americans or British. There is still plenty of issues, though. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s eroded public confidence in democratic institutions, while the Depression deepened unemployment and social discontent. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning's deflationary policies during the early 1930s exacerbated those economic woes, prioritizing paying off reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles over domestic recovery. And while these policies achieved some successes in reducing Germany's reparation burdens, they worsened the economic crisis, leading to greater political polarization within the actual German populace. But again, assuming the NSDAP and far-left factions are curbed, political unrest might be less of an important factor. However, again, this ability to curb unrest might be undermined by the fact that the proportional representation system and the power of the presidency in Weimar Germany were, to a degree, unfit for Germany's situation at the time. The dual power of the president and the Reichstag under the Constitution often led to political gridlock, propelling small disagreements into national crises. This is because the Constitution of Weimar Germany was modeled after the American system and created in an effort to amplify a wider range of political voices from across Germany. But in reality, it just ended up serving as a means for massive numbers of small, local parties to gain disproportionately large influence and prevent legislation from ever passing through. reforms that increase the president's powers, like Article 48, as long as it's used correctly, and reforms which implemented moderated proportional representation could have reduced the fragmentation and created more stable political coalitions within the parliament. A stable center-left coalition led by the Social Democratic Party, possibly in cooperation with the centrists, might have been able to prevent an almost inevitable strain to the extremes, if done right, perhaps under a figure like Friedrich Ebert. Additionally, a bit of deficit spending during the recessing German economic state in order to spur demand would have gone a long way. Had the Weimar government adopted these approaches, it could have perhaps reduced unemployment and restored public trust in the institutions for the time being. Avoiding Brüning's austerity towards paying back war reparations and instead focusing those state funds on infrastructure projects, welfare measures, and other relief for the German populace suffering an economic depression could help Germany regain its footing and allow for a wealthier state to emerge in the future, which would then have the capacity and surplus to pay back that which the Versailles Treaty demanded. Now, we should also note that without National Socialist economics, international relations would have remained more cooperative, possibly leading to an earlier and more favorable renegotiation of reparations, but also foreign investment from America and Britain. A continued focus on industrial modernization and technological innovation, as seen during the later Weimar years, could have positioned Germany as a robust economic player in Europe, just like how Japan, after World War II and Reconstruction, became a massive economic partner with the United States. So, assuming the stability of the Weimar Republic under the SPD and a gradual but successful economic recovery, relations with the Western powers of Britain and France could continue to grow closer by the early 1930s. By 1935, Germany, Britain, and France would likely find themselves partners in a diplomatic and economic ballet, rising out of the Great Depression slowly without the shock of war to start up the economies of the world. Italy, meanwhile, would stand awkwardly on the sidelines. Mussolini's aspirations clashed with his necessity to remain within the European political order and stand in opposition to communism. Really, Mussolini would have a few options, none of which would be particularly appealing, given that there was no Germany to form an axis of power with. Mussolini could pivot to the Americans, who viewed Italy favorably at the time. He could cut his plans for an invasion of Ethiopia and try to find a seat at the table with democratic Britain, France, and Germany, or he could simply try to ride it out solo, a path that would likely end in disaster for the Italian economy. For our purposes, we'll just ignore Italy for the time being. That's because the true specter looming over Europe was neither Mussolini nor the residual scars of the Great War. It was the Soviet Union, a monolith reshaped by Stalin's iron hand. While Stalin was articulating his theory of socialism in one country, behind closed doors, he was drafting up ambitious plans that gestured otherwise. As we know, the concept of socialism in one country certainly didn't stop him from exerting influence on other Eastern European states in the aftermath of the fall of Nazi Germany in our own history. Stalin knew that the Soviet Union was at a geographical disadvantage due to the European plain's flat, open terrain. The layout of the European plain made invading Russia, at least not in the winter, an easier task than one might expect. Stalin needed a buffer zone, and during the Cold War, this buffer came in the form of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and the various other countries of the Iron Curtain. All of these Central European states were brought under his eye so that the effective borders of Soviet influence stretched to the edges of the European plain and were safeguarded by mountain ranges from the Carpathians to the Bavarian Alps to the Transylvanian Alps. This meant that the suitable geographical invasion environment by which the West could attack the Soviet Union would be through Germany, and a series of other puppet states who would give the Soviets ample time to prepare and protect the USSR proper. Now, this vision of an Iron Curtain was never realized until the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, and as far as we know in recorded history, Stalin never explicitly expressed a desire to conquer Eastern Europe until that opportunity presented himself in the aftermath of the war. But still, it's not out of the question that these ideas of spreading Soviet influence were in his mind even in the 30s, as evidenced by Soviet intervention in the Spanish Civil War and his signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So, in this scenario, it's quite within the realm of possibility that Stalin would begin to formulate a plan to extend his influence into other realms of Eastern Europe, perhaps starting with the most immediate threat to his security, the very existence of the Polish state. By 1937, this vision would have evolved into a concrete plan. secret directives to the Red Army to prepare for an invasion of Poland. Soviet secrecy under Stalin's authority, skepticism, and paranoia was formidable, but no state is impervious to prying eyes. Captain Konrad Patzig, who ostensibly led the Abwehr through Weimar Germany's stable years, had begun reconnaissance flights over Poland in the early 1930s, primarily as a means of gathering intelligence on Soviet and Polish military capabilities, and to monitor troop movements, infrastructure, and potential defensive positions should a war play out in Polish lands. Patzig distrusted the intelligence given to him by the Lithuanians and Italian ciphers regarding Stalin's plans for Central Europe. But what the Abwehr lacked in information about Stalin's new plan, they compensated for with urgency. They needed a man on the inside, one who could learn of the communist plot and protect Germany from foreign invasion. Agent Adolf Hitler, by now a skilled veteran operative of Germany's Abwehr, stood before a dimly lit conference room in Berlin. His mission was dangerous, but it was critical: infiltrating Soviet ranks and uncovering the details of a rumored invasion of Poland. Stalin's ambitions could not be ignored, especially after a series of attempted communist uprisings in southern Germany, and the intelligence gleaned thus far by some of their agents was fragmentary at best. Agent Hitler's natural charisma, master of image and language, and capacity for manipulation made him the ideal candidate to wade into the shadowy waters of Soviet politics. Disguised as an Austrian Marxist sympathizer named Friedrich Heiss, Hitler crossed into Soviet territory with fake documents and a new identity under the guise of a cultural attaché visiting Moscow. His first task was to embed himself among the local intelligentsia and the small cadre of foreigners with access to government functionaries. He quickly and quietly caught the attention of mid-level apparatchiks in the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Within weeks, he had positioned himself as an ideological ally and secured an invitation to Kiev, the heart of military planning for the Southern Front. In Kiev, Hitler identified a junior officer, Captain Alexei Dubrovsky, whose loose tongue and penchant for vodka proved a treasure trove of information. Plying Dubrovsky with flattery and carefully dosed camaraderie, Hitler pieced together critical elements of the Soviet plan. From the captain's drunken boasts, he learned of a coordinated assault from Ukraine to the south and Byelorussia to the east, aimed at enveloping Poland in a pincer movement. Stalin's aim was not just to annex Poland, but to eradicate its independence in one swift, brutal campaign. The Red Army would prioritize Warsaw and Krakow, with special directives to crush uprisings in the border city of Lviv. The true breakthrough, however, came during a late-night poker game begrudgingly hosted by Dubrovsky's superior, Colonel Ivan Sokolov. Hitler, ever observant, noted Sokolov's tendency to fumble with his cigarette case. He was anxious to get back to his study. Something must be inside. Using a clever feint about restroom confusion, Hitler gained entry to the colonel's study and rifled through a locked drawer, uncovering a folded map detailing troop movements and supply lines. He pocketed the documents before quietly slipping back into the card game, his demeanor unshaken. The next morning, however, NKVD officers unexpectedly arrived at the military headquarters, their presence unsettling the entire garrison. Hitler quickly realized his position was compromised. Someone had tipped off the authorities about a foreign infiltrator. He escaped through the window, hitching a ride on the underside of a bus transporting troops for the south to Mykolaiv. His extraction plan required him to board a train bound for Odessa, where a German merchant vessel awaited him. However, the police had placed checkpoints at every station, inspecting papers and detaining anyone suspicious. He posed as a traveling journalist covering industrial progress in the Soviet Union, bluffing his way past several guards with a forged press pass and a fabricated story about a feature on workers' contributions to the glorious Soviet state. But as he approached the docks, he spotted an agent tailing him. Thinking fast, he orchestrated a distraction by tipping off a nearby fish vendor about a pickpocket, causing a fight to break out that blocked the street, and allowing him to slip into the maze of shipping containers. Running as fast as possible, he climbed aboard the German ship through the rear gangplank, narrowly avoiding detection as the vessel departed under the cover of night. Back in Berlin, the intelligence agent Hitler delivered caused a firestorm. The documents confirmed the scale and intent of Stalin's plans. Armed with this intelligence, the Germans sent word to Poland. Weimar Germany and the new Polish state, erstwhile adversaries from the scars of the Versailles Treaty, now found an opportunity to work together against a common cause, the threat of annihilation at the hands of the communists. Poland, for its part, mobilized reserves and fortified its eastern borders. While neither nation fully trusted the other, the Poles had no choice but to trust German intelligence. But there were two major issues. Germany was not in a position to defend Poland against the Soviets, as Germany was still bound by the Treaty of Versailles to an army of only 100,000 men, less than even Poland's mere 270,000 troops and 60,000 cavalry. Though Poland was undergoing a military modernization and expansion plan by 1936, it took place over the course of a slow 6-year timeline that saw an initial push which really lacked any substantive expansion of the army. Furthermore, the Germans couldn't bring this information to France or Britain. The Abwehr, according to the Treaty of Versailles, shouldn't exist, and thus any information gathered by agents of the Abwehr would put Germany's adherence to the treaty into question, and perhaps lead to more punishment. In Warsaw, as in Berlin, a nervous tension would thus grip the military establishment. If Poland was attacked, could the British and French come to aid fast enough? Would the Germans be able to put up enough of a fight alongside Poland? Would the Red Bear be held back? Or would Central Europe be overwhelmed, her peace broken by a flood from the east? Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.